Hello, everyone. Tonight's get-together is to celebrate the publication of George Behe's new Titanic book, Fate Deals a Hand, The Slippery Fortunes of Titanic's Professional Gamblers. However, George didn't want to be the main focus of our gathering, so he asked me to invite several of his best friends with whom to discuss the Titanic and field questions submitted by some of our members. In addition to George, tonight's guests we have here is Don Lynch, Bill Wormstead, J. Kent Layton, and we will be joined shortly by Mike Beatty. Don Lynch is the official historian of the Titanic Historical Society and has authored standard works like Titanic and Illustrated History and Ghosts of the Abyss. It was James Cameron's historical consultant for the film Titanic and accompanied one of Cameron's exploratory expeditions to dive to the Titanic wreck site. Bill Wormstead is a longtime member of the Titanic Historical Society and has co-authored outstanding Titanic books like On a Sea of Glass, Recreating Titanic, Report into the Loss of the SS Titanic, a centennial reappraisal, and was one of the guiding lights who ensured that the two Titanic inquiries were transcribed in their entirety and were posted online for use of historians everywhere. Thank you. Mike Beatty has written numerous articles for the Titanic International Society, is a leading expert on Titanic memorabilia, and possesses one of the world's most impressive collections of original Titanic-related artifacts and documents. J. Kent Layton, who we call Kent, has long been noted for authoring and co-authoring outstanding books like On a Sea of Glass, Recreating Titanic, Lusitania, an illustrated biography, Conspiracies at Sea, The Edwardians, Superliners, and many others. Tad Fitch was unable to join us, but I would like to introduce him. He's also a well-known researcher who has co-authored outstanding books like On a Sea of Glass, Recreating the Titanic, Into the Danger Zone, and Unseen Aquitania. As it happens, Tad and Kent have both told us that they'll try to be here with this evening, and we are very glad that Kent could join us, and we hope to have Tad join us another time. We will have another meeting. So I will open the meeting up if we all want to take turns introducing ourselves. I'll start with George since he's our author of Fate Deals a Hand, and this is his book coming out party. Go ahead, George.
Hello, everyone. I'm George. Originally, this book, Fate Deals a Hand, I originally wrote it as a commentator article for the THS in 1982. But I made some mistakes and included some information that turned out to be inaccurate. And it always bothered me that might be my final word on the subject. So as the years went by, I kept on stumbling across little bits of information about the gamblers and their later careers and their earlier careers and such. And so eventually I decided I had enough that I would like to update my commentator article and make it as accurate as I possibly could. So basically that's what happened here is this is an expanded version of my old commentary, containing a whole bunch of information that I didn't have access to 40 years ago. So anyone who decides to obtain a copy, I truly hope you'll enjoy reading it.
Thank you so much, George. Let's move on to Bill. Hi, Bill. Welcome. Have you on?
Yeah, I muted myself so that nobody would hear any background noise.
Yeah,
I'm Bill Wormstead. I've written a number of articles and co-wrote a number of books with Kent Layton and Tad Fitch. And that's about it.
Thank you. We'll go with Kent next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kent Layton. I have been a lifelong Titanic enthusiast, and about 20 odd years ago, I decided to try to turn my enthusiasm into something that was a little bit more long-standing, something that would stay behind. And so I went down the rabbit hole of trying to take my research and publish it. And I was fortunate enough to fall in with Tad Fitch and Bill Wormstead and with George. And we've worked together for many years ever since. And we've put out quite a few publications, and it really is a privilege and an honor for me to be with all of you tonight. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for coming. And last but not least, Don.
Well, hello, everybody. I don't have much to add to the introduction you gave me. And, since I was your interviewee the last time you met, I think I'm covered. But I'm glad to be here, and it's a pleasure and an honor. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us again. If anyone missed the meeting with Don, you can go on to our YouTube channel for the Titanic Book Club. All right, where should we start? Do we want to jump right into the questions? Let's see, we'll start here from Charlotte. I am interested in what other subjects you've all been interested in. I know Titanic interest can lead one to other areas of history, and wondered where you may have found interest in.
Well, I'll start, I guess. My other outside interests really have nothing at all to do with the Titanic. There's just a wide spread of subjects. I wrote myself a little list here so I could remember everything. I'm interested in 19th century African exploration, like the Stanley and Livingston type things. Richard Francis Burton. Biographies, this is sort of a recent interest, biographies of 19th century naturalists like Charles Darwin and Thomas Huxley and Alfred Russel Wallace and that sort of thing. I've had a long interest in the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the World War II bombing campaign over Germany. And I enjoy the Sherlock Holmes stories and Edgar Rice Burroughs and the Harry Flashman stories. I have a soft spot for those. So that pretty much covers my own outside interests.
Thanks, George. Does anyone else have outside interests besides Titanic?
I can leap in if you want. I also, I research other shipwrecks, some, and when I say research, read about mostly. I don't do a ton of research, like the Lusitania, the Andrea Doria, that sort of thing. And then I'm fascinated by the Romanov family, the last family of the Romanov dynasty. And but when it comes to actually digging in and doing research, I live in Los Angeles, and so I research a lot about generally my neighborhood in Los Angeles history, the people who lived here, things like that. I get active. I live in an area called West Adams, and we, up until COVID, had a strong heritage association, and we do home tours, cemetery tours, things like that. When the Art Deco Society does the Hollywood Forever Cemetery tour every year, you'll find me at the Clark Mausoleum, where Virginia Clark, who was on the Titanic, is interred. But LA histories where I actually roll up my sleeves and do research, but my other interests, I just read about them and let others do the research.
I'll chime in on the end of what Don said. I was on a Titanic convention, I forget how many years ago, but we were on we're staying on the Queen Mary, and we had a bus tour of Los Angeles. Don was kind of the unofficial tour guide. I remember we went through West Adams. I think you took us to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to recall we went into one little room and you pointed up and you said, "There's Gladys Cherry's ashes." Am I remembering that right?
Oh, that would have been Woodlawn, and I think it was Marion Kenyon.
Okay. Right.
She's up high in one of the mausoleums of Woodlawn. So one of the conventions we did the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and then the next one, rather than repeat, we went to Woodlawn because Marion Kenyon is there, and there's a cenotaph to William Hoyt, another passenger there at that cemetery.
Yeah, I think I've actually been on 2 tours with you in Los Angeles. I
Okay.
know, well, being I lived in Seattle for so long, getting to Los Angeles was easy. So whenever you did a THS convention on the West Coast, I went.
Oh, then you saw them both. Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Cool. I have diverse interests in a lot of different subjects. Like George, I really enjoy the Sherlock Holmes stories. I love history in general, especially 20th century history, 19th century history. I work in a family business. We restore pianos, so it crosses over to musical interest, classical music, film scores, things like that. So a lot of different and eclectic interests, but history and other ocean liners is probably my number one fascination.
I should point out to our guests that Mike Beatty told us he would be here around 6:15, so hopefully he'll be able to answer this question too when he arrives in the Zoom here.
Well, I guess that makes me up now. Like George, I'm also a very big Edgar Rice Burroughs fan. I've pretty much got everything he ever published, and even a couple of unpublished things. And ever since I was a little boy, I've been into comic books, collecting comic books, reading comic books. And now that I'm retired, I'm in the process of slowly selling off my comic book collections. And having comics that are like 50 years old, I can make a decent amount of money off them. In fact, I've got an auction going right now on Heritage that I should see some money in a couple months.
Jill, didn't you tell me recently that you've been asked to edit some of Edgar Rice Burroughs' books?
Yeah. The Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, the company that manages it, is reprinting some of the old books, and I've been asked to proof edit a couple of them. So that's off in the future. It'll be fun. I mean, I've been reading Burroughs for 50 years now, and I still get a big kick out of it. It's just fun. And George is sitting over smiling. He and I will occasionally talk Mangani to each other, which is the language of the apes that Tarzan grew up with. But yeah, Bundolo.
Yeah.
But like George, I also have read a number of books about the Little Bighorn. What's some of the other ones I've read? I've got other interests in history. I've also collected all of Walter Lord's books. I liked A Night to Remember so much, and one or two others. I finally said I got to get them all. So he doesn't have a lot of them, but they're all good. They're all worth reading. And as I've said many times before, A Night to Remember is an excellent book. I've read it 5 or 6 times. It's dated. I mean, he didn't have access to all the newer research we have, but it's still a damn good book and worth reading.
Yeah, I think I read one of his, I can't remember the title. He really talked about American history. I found it very interesting, and I like his style of writing.
Yeah, he's done books on Pearl Harbor, which I kind of have a fascination for because my Uncle Robbie was actually at Pearl Harbor on the battleship Tennessee. He lived, but it's kind of a personal connection for me.
I have his Alamo book, A Time to Stand. I enjoyed that.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. One of the books I found very hard of his to collect was Perry to the Pole. As far as I can figure out, it was only available to libraries. It was never out on the stands. Every copy I've seen or heard of, it has a property of so-and-so library in it. The copy I bought has that. And it's kind of written down for younger people, but it's still a good read.
Wow. So speaking of Walter Lord, were any of you able to meet him or talk with him?
Well, I
one of
did.
the
I spoke
THS
about that before, but someone else can jump in. George?
No, go ahead, Don. That's okay.
No, I was just saying that last, when the last time the book club met, I talked about when I met him around, I think it was 1981 at his home in New York. And, very gracious, very nice man. I think he already had early Parkinson's because I thought he drank a lot because he was kind of shaking a little bit, and he did mix a strong drink. But the thing I remember about him is that, he didn't want people to come and see his stuff. He wanted people to come and see him. And so if, there were certain things that you got all excited about his stuff and paid more attention to, his collection, I think you get a little hurt by that, but really, really nice man. And then he would come to the THS conventions.
That's the only place where I met Walter, was at one of the THS conventions. And it was during the time when the Lordite position seemed to be the most dominant position, and people were talking about the existence of mystery ships and how the light in the distance wasn't the Californian and all that sort of thing. And I had just written an essay about the Californian that I sent to him, and was able to meet him in person there. And he seemed so grateful to find a supporter. I was in his corner, because so much of the reactions that you would get would be hostile reactions from people who believed that the Californian was 20 miles away. That always impressed me, that he was so grateful, really.
Yeah, one thing about Walter was that it seemed like he didn't want to admit there might be a mistake in his books. Like, he would never admit that J. Yates wasn't on the Titanic, as I recall, because he had in his book that J. Yates was on the Titanic, touching on Fate Deals a Hand. But, when you look at what he wrote about the Californian, basically he followed like the British Inquiry and their findings. And in a way, he got lucky. He got lucky that it turned out there wasn't a ship between them, and that it really was the ship that saw the rockets. Because, not really lucky, because what other ship sent up rockets? But, he fortunately, and for his position, it turned out in the long run that there wasn't another ship out there between them or anything like that.
He did occasionally use his imagination just in minor ways. One thing that sticks in my mind is right before Fred Barrett left the boiler rooms, all of a sudden the water burst through, and he ran to the ladder and started up. And Walter said he turned around and saw one of the engineers sort of forcing his way through the water to get to the not storeroom, but the room where Engineer Shepard had been taken supposedly after he broke his leg. And he said that Barrett saw this man running or trying to get to the room there to help rescue Shepard. And every account that I've ever seen by Barrett said nothing about that at all. He apparently didn't look around, and he didn't see that. But it made a colorful addition, even though it wasn't strictly true. There was a couple of other things too, but they were just minor things. Just added a little color where maybe some color was lacking, possibly.
When I was working on the Titanic inquiry transcriptions, and then later on reading A Night to Remember again, I'm reading A Night to Remember and I'm going, that's where Walter got that from. And I was seeing the same things in the inquiry testimony and in Walter's book. It was the same exact stuff. And as far as I'm considering what he had to work with, Walter did an excellent job of picking information out of the inquiries.
Absolutely. He did a better job than a lot of modern day authors are doing with their books.
That's
Yeah.
very true.
And he also had the ability to make it read well. It wasn't just dry. It was, you could hardly put one of his books down when you read it.
His books read like A Night to Remember reads like a disaster novel.
Yeah. Mhm.
And
Well put.
it just pulls you in, and it just carries you along. And it's like I said, I've read it 5 or 6 times. I'm sure I'll read it again at some point.
I see our friend Michael Beatty has arrived. There we go.
Yes,
Hey, Mike,
Michael's
Hey
here.
guys,
Hi.
how you doing?
welcome.
Thank you. Finally made it.
That'll be $5, please.
Uh, put it on my tab.
Okay, we'll do.
Uh,
Welcome, Michael. I'll introduce you again. We've just been joined by Michael Beatty, who's written numerous articles for the Titanic International Society. He's a leading expert on Titanic memorabilia and possesses one of the world's most impressive collections of original Titanic-related artifacts and documents. We're so glad you're here, Michael.
oh, nice to be here.
We were just discussing Walter Lord, but you missed the introductions. I didn't know if you wanted to introduce yourself.
Oh, what do you want to know about me? Mike Beatty.
Oh, Beatty, okay.
Beatty,
Couldn't make
yeah,
it.
yeah. That's nobody's ever gotten that right in my whole life. They always say Beatty, and my wife had to get used to that.
It is good to get proper pronunciations once in a
Yeah.
while.
Well, I thought George's name was Behe for years.
Yeah, I've had all sorts of pronunciations, so I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I live outside of Philadelphia. Been into the Titanic since the early 80s, I guess. Started when I was like 7, 8, pretty much like everybody else seems to get the bug. And here I am many years later.
We're glad to have you.
You too.
Hey, Jill, is anybody else having problems with Mike's picture?
Yeah, it
Yes,
looks like
it's-
it's
It looks like he's
flickering.
flashing all the different people that are here.
Yeah.
it looks like how I feel right now.
Okay. I was wondering, is that doing that for you too, Michael?
Yeah, I'm looking. I'm like, I think that's me.
All right. Why is it doing that? Let's see.
Maybe he should sign out and back in.
We can try that.
Want to try that? Okay. All right. I thought that was just my.
How's that? That looks
There
better.
we go.
Oh,
there
you
There we go.
Perfect. Oop,
Uh-oh.
Up, you messed it up.
Oh,
We had to go and say something.
I blame static electricity.
yeah.
Okay, now you're stable,
Ah,
kind of.
You're
Wonder what's
stable now. Yay. Michael, we were all talking about
Walter Lord.
Lord and whether folks had met him before. Had you met Walter Lord?
I did briefly get to meet him at the 87 convention, the THS convention in Wilmington. So that was very cool. He's a really nice guy. And actually, before that, we had a project in school to write to an author. So I wrote to him, and I guess I never heard back for the rest of the school year. And like, I think I went to the convention, and then like the next school year, I finally get a letter in the mail, and it was from Walter Lord. I guess he's been, having a lot of health issues and stuff. So took a long time to catch up, but he finally wrote me back and wrote me a really nice letter. I still have it. It was really nice of him.
Oh, that's nice. Wow.
Yeah, he was a gentleman, that's for sure.
Yeah, very much so.
All right, we'll move on here to Lauren's question. It's a long question. My question for the panel: what do you make of the story about Bride and Phillips attacking the stoker? Do you think Bride really claimed this, or is it more likely the journalist who conducted the interview made it all up to make his account sound more dramatic? As we now know, happened with many other alleged newspaper interviews with various survivors. That's our first question.
I can't remember if he mentioned that in one of his inquiry
He did.
sessions, did he?
Yeah, he did mention it, I think, in the British inquiry. And it was very brief, and I think they just sort of, they said something as like he sort of alluded to the fact that the guy never left the wireless room. It's like he just sort of said, well, I'm comfortable. There's something like, I'm sure he didn't leave the room or something, which didn't say we killed him. It's sort of like maybe we knocked him out or something. But I kind of wonder if he wasn't put upon to say that at the inquiry because of the New York Times interview. If he didn't feel like he had to admit to that. And so I don't think the fact that he said it at the inquiry really proves that it actually happened. I'd love to know if he ever mentioned it ever again after that. But I don't think we really have any interviews with Bride after the inquiries. I think he just went away and that was the end of it.
It's sort of like his newspaper mention of the tune Autumn. He never mentioned it anywhere else except in that interview. And as you discovered, the reporter who wrote that article sort of admitted that it might contain a bit of fiction.
Yeah, that somebody, well, credit where it's due. I think it was Park Stevenson who found that actual reference in a book or something, where the guy who actually wrote the article said, if ever I wrote fiction in my career, it was that night. And he was referring to Harold Bride's article, the interview. So, and when you read the New York Times interview and then read his inquiry testimonies, the two different inquiries, it's like there's three different people, you know, they're completely different. So I don't think he was a good witness. So but I think because he had, you know, he got paid for that New York Times interview and taken this, what was a huge amount of money for the time, I think he felt compelled to claim that it did happen. So I wish there was another witness to it, then we could be sure.
George, is Bride the only one who mentioned Autumn in the early days?
He was the first.
Okay.
Don has found one or two people who mentioned it later. Whether their mention is independent or whether they read his interview and thought, well, it must be true. I honestly don't know. But he was the first, and there were 3 or 4 others later on.
Yeah, I think Helen Candy wrote in her account in Collier's, which was pretty soon afterwards, but obviously she would have read Bride's account by that time. And then I always go with Margaret Hayes, because her quote was that old familiar tune, Autumn, and which to me is kind of convincing. And I know there was somebody else who had right afterwards said, but I can't remember who. But so in my opinion, is that it was played at some point. It just probably was very unlikely it was the last song that was played.
I agree with that. Can't remember if I mentioned in my recent thing with Don and others, but I found 10 survivors who wrote actual letters mentioning that they heard the tune Nearer My God to Thee. None of them mentioned Autumn, and nobody ever mentioned Song to Autumn. So take it for what it's worth.
And going back to George's book, he wrote an excellent book called Those Brave Fellows about the band and the last song.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Bill.
like the little chart that's in there of how many people heard what.
Yeah, great book. That's why I
Okay.
collect all the Behe books.
Yeah.
I loved your shelf.
Yeah, George, you pushed my books right off the shelf.
No,
You can fit your stuff and my stuff on the same shelf.
Well, that's why you don't invite him to your home.
your stuff deserves to be there just as much as mine, Bill.
Yeah, but there's a lot more Behes than Wormstead stuff.
I've just got a bigger mouth than most, that's all.
More free time. All right, her next question said, other than the ridiculous conspiracy theories, what misconceptions and myths about the Titanic still get reported as facts and frustrate you all the most?
The number of survivors and died.
Well, why did I know you were going to say that, Bill?
I always say that. It's just, you know, Walter Lord and A Night to Remember said 705, and that was the best information at the time. For the last 20 years, we've had, let's see, George, maybe you can help me on this. There were 3 or 4 researchers that all came to the same numbers. Phil Gowan, Herman Soldner, and Lester Mitchum. They all came to the same numbers. They actually, we have, like George has said, we have the names. If you want to say 705 people or only survived, well, who are you going to kill off? These other researchers all say 712.
What about, I've always wondered, there's that one guy whose name was apparently scratched off some list. And I think there's some record that his passage was refunded. And I can't remember his name. He was like a Swedish passenger or something like that, one of the third class ones. And he was on his way to Minnesota. And somebody said, well, he shows up in the census records there, but it's such a common name. I don't think you can swear that's him. And to me, that's the only thing out there that could differ, may cause the numbers to be just a little bit different, because it looks like there's one person who's on the list of victims who may not have been on board. And I can't remember who it is, but it's like a Swedish gentleman.
Yeah, I run across reference to who that person might be, but I don't remember the details right now.
Yeah, and that's the only questionable one I've ever heard of. It's funny how some people do say, like, can't think of the guy's, Albert Stewart, I think it was, in first class. His family always believed that he and his valet were lost. And there's no valet on the passenger list, and there's no one who, if he did, he didn't pay for his passage. But, you get that, with families, where, they think somebody else was maybe with them. Of course, they don't remember the name of the valet or anything like that. But yeah, I think the guy from Sweden is the only one you could seriously question. And I don't think anybody else you can, because we have names.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the statement, over 1,500 died. No, it was exactly 1,496. It's not over 1,500. Anything over 1,500 is wrong.
Yeah.
That's what irks me, as Kent knows.
Somebody told me once that if you die within a year, you're still considered one of the victims. And whether that has to be if you died from effects of the sinking or not, I don't know. But they said that statistically in disasters, and somebody said this years and years ago, they said anybody who dies within a year of that actual event is considered a victim. Like, what if somebody, one of the people they pulled into boat 4 had died as they sailed into New York Harbor? We would probably consider them one of the victims. But at what point, how many days, how many months before you stop counting? So, given the fact that there were like 3 or 4 people, well, at least 3 who died before the year was over, you still don't get to 1,500, but you could argue for that.
I recall there's the occasional survivor too who said that the 4 people who were taken on board the Carpathia died later. Now, whether they died later or whether they were dead when they were taken aboard, I don't know, but there is the occasional person who says that. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But obviously those are 4 victims.
Yeah, they would have had to have been the people in boat 4 and that everybody thought was dead, and maybe they revived them on the deck. But I think what happened, because they had that one Carpathia passenger who passed away, and I think people thought that might have been a Titanic passenger who died on the way to New York. And, it's funny because like Ruth Becker, she saw them bring Mrs. Abbott on board. And when she saw them burying people later, she assumed Mrs. Abbott had died because she looked so awful when they brought her on board. She was so close to death anyway that Ruth just assumed that she was one of the people they buried from the ship. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing too much talking.
Yeah.
That's
There's
a
also number 14 who was pulled alive into lifeboat 14, but then he died in 14, and I'm pretty sure he was one of the bodies buried off the Carpathia.
Yeah, he was. William Hoyt, yes.
Mike,
And
I
just
did.
not long ago, Mike obtained a document from his collection of the names of Rhoda Abbott and her 2 sons when they traveled to Europe on the Olympic, to England on the Olympic before the Titanic disaster. He was quite pleased to be able to find that.
Yeah, she sailed back and forth a bunch of times, and she always sailed under the name Rosa. And that's how she signed her name. And so I know, on Encyclopedia Titanica, there's an article about her, and it said that she was hard to track down because they said that Titanic was the only time she used the name Rosa. And that was not true. I mean, she went back and forth a number of times after she came to America and always used the name Rosa and always signed her name on every document that way. But yeah, it's just, sad that she was on the Olympic, but kind of interesting that that's the ship she chose, and probably felt very safe on the Titanic as a result.
Probably knew her way around the ship too, the Titanic, that is.
Yeah,
from her past experience.
true. I'll throw out this little story. Like I said, I feel like I'm talking too much, but second class passenger Henriette Evois, she only sailed on 3 ships in her life: the Empress of Ireland, the Lusitania, and the Titanic. And those are the only ships she sailed on. And unfortunately, she sailed on the Titanic at the wrong time.
You can make a pretty good conspiracy theory there
Yeah.
if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone could create.
There's a
create
lot of, oh, I'm sorry, Joe. I
No, that's
didn't
all
know.
right. I was
Uh,
just thinking about how crazy people, they come out with these theories and then everyone goes for it. Like, what? Really? And then they use it. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Now, I was just going to say there's a lot of old information that there have been revisions to, because, we have access to a lot more material now when we're doing our research than, there was available to researchers 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So just because it's in an old book or documentary program or whatever doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but it gets picked up, and Titanic is almost like I've come to describe it as like a security blanket to some people, I think, where they have this vision of it having taken place a certain way. And if you try to, take new information, sometimes there's an emotional reaction to a revision of history. Like with the center propeller, I know it's something that's caused a lot of controversy over the past 5-10 years. Everyone, they think of the center propeller as having 4 blades. It's the way all the models have shown it, the movies, everything. And lo and behold, there's documents that actually show that it had 3 blades. And there's been a lot of pushback on that, and in some other areas too. And I think it just is like, wow, I thought that it had been put to bed, and then all of a sudden you see it again, and it's like, oh dear.
It seems to be constant. I mean, just this last week, Mark Chirnside is the one who found the documentation of the 3-bladed propeller, and somebody was arguing with him and said, well, you're going to have to show me a picture of the 3-bladed feller to prove it to me. And somebody replied saying, how about you show us a picture of the 4-bladed propeller? That's correct. The one picture that they keep saying is the 4-bladed propeller on Titanic. There's proof that picture was, I just read this just in the last day or so, was taken in 1924 off the Olympic. But that's the picture everybody thinks is the Titanic. It's on a lot of this stuff, like Kent's implying, you can't win. They don't want to believe, even when you have proof.
And they know
That's-
nothing about the subject. That's the frustrating part, is they're coming from a position of zero documentation, of zero knowledge, and yet they're insisting that their information or their statement is correct. And yet they can't support it. That doesn't stop them from insisting that they're correct. It's tremendously frustrating.
Yeah.
Mark Chirnside is a recognized researcher, a good researcher, and they're telling him he's lying. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. But
Yeah.
Mark's written a number of great books, and for us here, we all think he does good work. We know he does good work.
Mhm.
Tremendous work. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, they'll watch a program on television, and there've been a lot of theories that have been put out there, kind of, if it was on the internet, it would be called clickbait, but it's really in television programs, it's to keep people going past the next commercial break. And they try to grab headlines or come up with a new theory. And sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes they find some new piece of the puzzle that's very interesting. But a lot of times it's unfortunate because you see misinformation based on, quote, new evidence or new leads or new theories, that it kind of becomes like a spin, and it kind of goes out of control very quickly, which is, it's too bad.
A lot of that false information feeds on itself too. A lot of you know about the Anne Isham Great Dane story. That story originally was in a children's novel written by Marty Crisp, And yet I wondered at the time, or cautioned her at the time, people are going to take this as the truth because all of your other information is pretty accurate. But she wanted to use it just as a plot device. Well, somewhere along the line, somebody transferred that information from her novel to fact. And now you see it everywhere and people accept it as fact. And it's, I swear, it's frustrating.
If I see that one more time.
It's the only shaggy Great Dane I've ever heard of.
I think also John Jacob Astor's body and the reported manner of his death is something that you see crop up time and again over and over.
Yes.
I know exactly where that originated. It was in one of my mind went blank. Dan Butler, his book. He said that Astor's body was found crushed and covered with soot. No evidence for that, but that's where it came from, and you see people quoting that. So
George has
there's
an
no
article on his
saying
website that shows that
the-
Astor didn't get crushed.
yeah.
Well, I
There's an
actually
old
found,
saying that, go ahead, Mike.
I remember, George, I showed you that magazine I found a few years ago. It was like a funeral train magazine.
Yeah,
And it actually had an interview with the embalmer for Astor, and it went through like a detailed description of the embalming. So, and he said he was actually in very good condition.
Yeah.
So
that was a wonderful document, by the way.
Yeah.
That was really an outstanding find.
So that pretty much, yeah. I mean, there's a few things that have kind of put that myth to rest, but that one definitely was the final nail, I think.
Did we answer the question?
I think so. That was pretty good. And I do want to recommend people to go to Bill Wormsted's page. He has a link to proven facts about Titanic. And do you update that once in a while, Bill, or are you pretty much?
I haven't updated it in a couple of years. I've added a few things at the bottom a couple of years ago, but just basic stuff that we have proof on. And I started off with the number of survivors and the number died and that kind of stuff. I do mention the 3-bladed propeller. Oh, I forget what else I put on there. I've probably got 13 or 14 different items.
Oh,
Yeah.
Smith and Andrews, how they ended up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was a great find. Yes.
yeah, we've got that both in On a Sea of Glass and in our new book, Recreating Titanic and Her Sisters, with Tad and Kent.
That was a startling find. I remember the night we put that together when we were working on A Sea of Glass. That was one that literally, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. When you connected the dots, we already knew that Captain Smith had probably gone off from the port side of the bridge. But then all of a sudden, when I read two different, you're looking at it and it's like, wait a minute, these two different accounts are from different
They
sources.
dovetail.
Yeah,
They
and
dovetail.
it's like, wow. And then someone shared with us, there were two newspaper accounts that Fitzpatrick gave. And there's a short version, which is commonly available. And then there's a longer version, which is the one that was given to us. And it was like, it matched up perfectly with the report from Galloway when he was going back on the Lapland. And since then, we've only found more that kind of dovetails into that picture rather than, knocking out the underpinnings of that. And that still just is shocking to me that it's like, wow, that was a major find for me.
Just within the past week, I had an exchange in one of the Titanic groups with this guy who insisted that there's no evidence that Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews ever tried to leave the Titanic. And several people gave him the information that you guys discovered. Didn't matter. They did not try to leave the Titanic. That's, all you can do is throw up your hands, really.
Some people don't want to know. They don't want to know the truth.
Yep.
Well, I can throw a wrench in the Thomas Andrews story. It suddenly occurred to me, we always read about how, he's going around and telling people to get on your life jackets and telling the crew members this and that. Did he ever leave first class? Did he ever make any effort to urge the people in second class or third class to get to the boats? Or did he just focus on first class? Because the only evidence I've ever seen where people saw him, now granted, second and third class were less likely to recognize him, but the crew members might have. And yet, I don't think he was ever, except for when he made that initial inspection going down into the bow and back, I don't think anybody ever saw him anywhere but first class.
I remember he talked to one or two stewardesses and told them, what was going on. But those were stewardesses who were on the upper decks.
Right, in first
So
class.
That
Yeah.
kind of goes along with what you're saying.
So all this thing, get your passengers into the boats, everything else. I know people love him, and I respect him. That obviously is very heroic and hard for him to watch his ship go down. But and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I just think it's kind of funny that there was never any witness who saw him trying to get the second and third class people into the boats and trying to, now maybe out on the decks he did, but to actually go into second and third class and be in the corridors wasn't seen there.
Not that I recall.
Yeah, so I'll probably be hated by everybody because he's so popular. And I'm not trying to take away from him. I'm just pointing that out, that we don't have any evidence of him being there. It doesn't mean he didn't. We just don't have any evidence that he went into any class except first to try to get people out of the cabins and into the boats.
That's an interesting observation. You never put that together in my head before.
That's the neat thing about gatherings like we're having tonight is you can, bounce ideas off the other person and get some new perspectives sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much. So after so many years of research, would you say anyone has come up with a definitive conclusion as to what happened to first class ladies Edith Corse Evans and Ann Isham, and why didn't they make it off the ship safely? This is another question from Lauren.
Don, who was the lady who came to her defense when Gracie sort of gave an inaccurate version?
Well, it was a friend of Edith Evans who claimed that Colonel Gracie, was wrong. And it was because, basically the story that she kind of gave up and walked away because, he claimed that Edith Evans told him that she'd been told by a fortune teller that she would die on the water. And he sort of implied that that was her reason for not getting in the lifeboat. But that implies suicide, and suicide had such a stigma in 1912. And so her best friend took exception to it publicly, in the newspapers, that she didn't believe that at all. Supposedly, George Reams told Edith Rosenbaum that Edith Evans was on collapsible A in the beginning. I haven't seen that document. And so I also, kind of question, because we have this description, this friend of Edith's, she had gotten a letter from Mrs. Brown, Carolyn Brown, who was with Edith when she almost got into the boat, and said as she was sort of climbing over the rail, her dress got caught. Well, there is no railing at collapsible D, which sort of makes me think that they were trying to get into boat 4. And then when she said, I'll get in the next boat, that she was going forward to collapsible D. Which goes against what Gracie said. And then, so it's kind of confusing, but apparently, she got caught on the railing, according to Mrs. Brown, didn't get in and said, I'll get in the next one. And then for whatever reason, didn't get in the next one and ended up swimming to collapsible A, except again, I've never seen that documentation. I've only heard that it exists, and then died before help arrived. As far as Ann Isham, we don't know. Nobody saw her. There were no witnesses. And but I've made this quote a lot over the last few years because it's very revealing, is that we have 20/20 hindsight. We know that if you got into a boat, you survived. They didn't know that. And that's what Edwina Trout Mackenzie told me, when I asked, well, why did you wait till the last boat? And she said, well, when a ship sank, you died. And she said, I figured I might as well die on the little boat as the big one. And so it's very possible that Anne Isham was just afraid. She probably was convinced she was going to die anyway. I mean, she was older for the time. She was probably 50. And, but at the time, growing up in that era, when a ship went out to sea, it just disappeared. And that was it. And so she probably, gave up and didn't try to get into a boat. And I'm sure, and other people did as well, I'm sure. There's a great quote with Carl Baer where he was in boat 5. And I'm trying to think, it might have been Norman Campbell Chambers, I think, I could be wrong. But he suddenly shows him his revolver and says, well, when my wife and I have finished with it, you and your wife, referring to his fiance, can use it. It's sort of like, well, when we get down to where we're eating each other, we're just going to commit suicide. And so, getting into a lifeboat, they didn't know that it guaranteed your survival. So it's very possible that Anne Isham just thought, you know what, I'm just not going to risk it. I'm just going to take my chances on the ship, and went down with the ship. And as far as Edith Evans, we know she tried to get into a boat and it didn't work out. And then apparently ended up on collapsible A and then passed away there.
And of course, even if somebody knew her after she left that scene, by that point, so late in the disaster, there were so few people who were on the ship still who survived the night.
Yes.
That even if she did interact with someone else in those last minutes, there's a 2/3 possibility they probably didn't make it. So, it's one of those probably mysteries, unless something turns up in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know the family. I'm trying to think. I was in touch with a relative of Anne Isham's years ago, and I can't remember if it was a niece or a great niece. She was an older lady, and she had nothing to add to it but I know the family in 1912 wrote to people, and everybody did. All the families of every victim wrote to survivors saying, did you know my loved one? And Colonel Gracie said that, he had heard from the family and everything. And so if they got any letter back, they didn't save it. There was no knowledge in the family that Anne Isham had been seen again. So you're right. She may have just hung around with maybe a few table companions who were gentlemen and ended up going down with them or something. That could very well be.
I don't know if Jill can still hear us, but to intersperse with the questions that have been posed to us, I asked Mike if he could put a selection of his artifacts and documents at hand, so occasionally he can pop in and show us some of his items and maybe create additional topics for conversation. So, Mike, do you have something that you might like to show us?
Sure. Yeah, I have a little pile here that I got going for you. Let's see how this works. I had to unmirror the screen so you can read it. So it'll probably look like I've been drinking here. Let's see. The first item here I got is Thomas Andrews Shipbuilder. To 1912. Now this came out, there was a US and a UK edition, which is usually the plain green cover with the black print. And then they made this special, like they call a leather edition, which I guess they gave out to, very limited. This one in particular is signed inside. And let's see if you can see it there. It's signed by Thomas Andrews' parents, and they made it out to May Sloan. Who was the stewardess, and I guess she was friends with Tommy, as she called him, Tommy. And I think they didn't she run into him, I think, the evening of the 14th, and because he was kind of getting homesick, and she kind of cheered him up a little bit. And then I guess later that night, she credits him for pushing her in the lifeboat. But then after the later on, I guess his parents really seeked her out to kind of give them some closure on his last, hours on board. And after a couple of years after I found this book, a letter popped up at auction, and I'll read you a little bit of it, which actually references books. I was pretty surprised when it showed up. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it. It went for a good price. Because May Sloan stuff just doesn't show up ever. So she wrote, "Dear Mr. Andrews," which was his dad, "just a note to thank you for the book, which reached me safely before the Olympics sailed. I know I shall find it most interesting on the voyage out. I will have plenty of time to read it." So she took this on her. It was on Olympic stationery. So she did go back to work on the Olympic. When was the letter? The letter was in June 5th. So she was back on the working by June 1912. So that was
What a wonderful companion piece that would have been to have with your
yeah,
book.
I tried, but you know how this stuff, you gotta have deep pockets sometimes to get some of this good stuff. But I was lucky to just get the book. It was just something that showed up, on eBay, and I got it before somebody else did.
Outstanding. Got a second item while we're talking?
Sure.
Yeah, this gives everybody a little break.
Do another one. So this one is called The Nautical Telegraph Code. It's a little red book, and this issue was done in 1908. And the gist of it was sending Marconi grams was actually pretty expensive back then. It was new, and this was a whole book of basically code words, and you'd have a like land lists, and it'll say come to blank and wait for me there. So you can send one word and send a whole message. Now this particular book happened to belong to Officer Lowe, so which was a pretty neat connection.
Absolutely.
So in the back, let me find it here. There's a back section where you could write custom, make your own messages up. So if you look in here, this is all in his handwriting, and here we go. So he's made all his own notes in here for different things. Now, I guess the question with this book is, was this the one he had to replace the one he would have lost on board? Or his family would have had a copy of this as well, so they could decipher what he said. My hunch is probably this was the family's copy. So this was a pretty neat find. And he's got notes all throughout different things, but pretty neat.
Yep. As you guys can tell, Mike is a serious collector. He's in the first rank. He's got some wonderful, wonderful items.
Yeah, I definitely I've gotten lucky over the years. I've been able to get things I only dreamed of, back as a kid. I can't complain.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
Maybe
Some
we
of-
can
some of the
answer a couple
collecting-
more questions.
Some
I'm
of the
sorry.
some of the collecting stuff like Mike doing boils down to when did you start buying some of this stuff?
Yeah.
There's, like I mentioned earlier, I'm into the comic book things. There's comic books I bought decades ago that I couldn't possibly afford now. I bought the very first Spider-Man comic in 1972 for $7 whole.
Wow.
And at that point, it was 10 years old. Well, now it's worth a lot more than that now. In fact, I sold it a couple years ago. And
Yeah.
Mike, if Mike bought something 20 years ago, he could probably couldn't afford it now.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the last 10, 20 years. It's really, it's funny to listen to guys back in the 80s, they were still finding postcards for, under $1, and now, you can't touch one for probably under 100. And then the sky's the limit from there. You go to something, rarity or something signed, passenger and anything one board, forget it now. It's, that's a dream for me.
But when they found the ship, prices went sky high, because George and I in 1984 went over to London and we hit a bunch of postcard shows, and you could get a pre-sinking Titanic for just $1 or $2 or £1 or £2. And once they found the wreck, there was no buying those again, not at an affordable price, that's for sure.
Did things jump up in price when Cameron's movie come out, Don?
They must have, because a lot of stuff came on the market then. So I think things did. Well, there was, one of the THS members, we met him on one of the heritage tours, And he had been given the keys that Samuel Hemming had in his pocket, and Hemming had given them away. And so his own family didn't have them. And then when the movie came out, he sold them for like £100,000 or something and bought a house.
Wow.
And when I met him before the movie came out, he had no intention of selling them. It had been given to him, and he had this great artifact from the Titanic. And suddenly he could buy a house if he sold them. So he did.
And the Centennial was a big jump too in 2012. There
Yes.
was a lot of increases with that. And it's calmed down a little bit from that, but it's still, if you look at the trend, everything just keeps going up.
And that's why I sell things and don't buy things.
No
Mark,
more
I-
buying. Mhm.
I didn't hear that.
So the Bill's like, no more buying for me.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you know,
Oh, I had to slow down too.
It's
hard.
like George kind of alluded, well, when George and I were, when I was over his house last year, he kind of alluded to this stuff. What's going to happen to my great collection? Who's going to take it? Who wants it?
Goodwill.
There's a lot of things I have here that my kids don't want it. I might as well just sell it now when I can still get a good price for it. Because if I give it to my kids, they're gonna say, no, I don't want this, throw it away.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sure George is in the same boat, Don, and eventually Kent will.
Another 30 or 40 years. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You guys are always thinking negative. I keep telling you, you guys, it's gonna be a while before you have to face that, guys. So let's think positive here.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just got a
Yeah.
good doctor's report yesterday, so I'm feeling better about myself.
Oh,
Good.
good. Congratulations. Hey, I didn't ask how long you all wanted to chat. We have a lot of questions, so we can go as long as you want, or we can try to convene again. I just want to gauge how everyone's feeling or how much time everyone wants to be here.
I guess
can
I
go
can sit here
longer.
as long as anybody else. So
I can go on. What's the next question?
All right, let's go to the next question here. Can you tell us about the research process that you undertake when writing a book about the Titanic and her passengers, and how do you ensure that your work is accurate and thorough?
George, you're the lead guy.
I don't. I just write stuff. No, all you can do is, I guess, don't necessarily rely on the first bit of research information that you come across. There's so many people, like the 3-bladed, 4-bladed propeller and stuff. They come across the 4-bladed picture, and that's it forever as far as they're concerned. Just keep on researching and compare the information that you find, and don't take anything for granted. I've known of people who have written a Titanic book in 6 months or so, 6 or 8 months, just from slapping stuff together. My Archie Buck trilogy, it took me 8 years to write those, of both research and writing. You can't do this stuff overnight if you want your project to be worthwhile. You're going to have to be careful, evaluate the evidence. Everyone makes mistakes. I'm not saying you'll ever be perfect, because my stuff certainly isn't perfect. But at least it'll be accurate enough that people will take your work seriously, instead of knowing that you slap something together in 6 months and put it out there, and expect people to swallow everything whole, because it's not going to happen. A lot of people will swallow it whole, but there's enough serious researchers out there who won't, that at least that'll provide a cautionary word of caution for you. Just do your best and do your research and compare your information. And I guess that's pretty much the only advice that I can give. Anyone else add to that?
Well, original
Document-
sources.
Yes.
Document your
absolutely.
sources. Document your
Absolutely.
sources. Don't
Absolutely.
just say something happened without saying why you think that.
Yeah.
I've
Yep.
always made the crack of, footnote the hell out of it. That's what we did in On a Sea of Glass. We've got, I think I counted them up once, over 1,600 footnotes.
Mm.
It's a lot of footnotes, but we felt that's the kind of book we wanted to write.
Yeah.
And I know George puts a lot of backup detail in his books. And other people do too, but then there's other books that there's no backup details. Dan Butler's book was, as I recall, didn't have a lot of backup detail.
Yeah, when I wrote Illustrated History, I think Walter Lord's book, because he interviewed survivors firsthand, his is one of the few non-original sources I used. And what I did for that book was I went through everything I had at the time. Now, granted, that was 30 years ago. Today, it would take a lot longer. And I took notes, and then I put them all on 3x5 index cards. And I've got a big box of these cards in the order, basically, that the book occurs, is written. And so I had original sources for everything, whether it was really, and I did make obviously a few mistakes, but, the sources were there. And so, but I always say, go with original sources, don't just feed off of somebody else's books. Don't grab Jeffrey Marcus's book and Walter Lord's book and Daniel Butler's book and write from that. You just can't. You have to go back to the original documentation. Otherwise, if something's slipped in, it's going to slip into yours.
Absolutely. I think another thing that I would say to go along with what you guys already said is don't start with a conclusion and then look for evidence to back it up. Or don't come at it from just one angle. Try and find, because we only have, a third of the puzzle pieces of the story. Try to find where you can see things line up from looking at it from different perspectives. I call it a bullseye pattern starts to emerge where, 2, 3, 4 different people will touch on the same thing, but in different ways. And you can kind of get the aggregate, you get this kind of like center mass that you can kind of see, okay, this is probably what happened. And you get some outlying accounts out here that might contradict it or maybe fill in the blank, supplement it, but you at least can get the main picture kind of comes into focus a bit.
Yeah, and they'll come together. Things do come together, because I remember when I was writing Illustrated History, and Bruce Ismay always said in his testimony that Captain Smith walked up with that telegram about the ship needing tow or whatever, and handed it to him and didn't say a word. And then about the ice warning. That was it. It was the one about the ice warning and all that. And he always said that Smith handed it to me and didn't say a word. And then in Jack Thayer's account, he mentioned that, I've got to think how it all came together, but, that he and his parents ran into Ismay, I think it was, and Ismay told them when they would be reaching the ice. Well, how did he know that? Did he sit there and go to the chart room and ask? No, I mean, when Smith handed him the telegram, he talked to him. He didn't just hand it to him and not say a word. And so when you do that, pieces of the puzzle will suddenly fit together. And it's like, okay, now that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. He just walk up, hand this to him and not say anything and walk. Maybe if they'd had a falling out that afternoon over, over how fast to go, who knows? But obviously Smith said something, because Bruce Ismay somehow understood that they would be reaching the ice around 9 o'clock. And then according to Lightoller, at 5 minutes to 9, Smith appeared on the bridge. So Smith obviously believed it would be at 9 o'clock. He hands a telegram to Ismay, and Ismay's telling people we're reaching the ice around 9. So Ismay telling people also Smith never said a word is just false. And the pieces will come together. If you really get back to your original sources, it all comes together eventually. Most of it.
Thank
And
you
that's
so
What you just said too just adds a little bit of credibility to the reports that Titanic may have passed 2 or 3 early icebergs.
Yeah.
If they were expecting to encounter ice at 9 o'clock that evening, they had 2 hours to steam through this area. And as I mentioned earlier too, according to the diagram in the Senate investigation, the Titanic did steam right through an outlying band of icebergs before it ever reached the ice field itself. So, you know, it's not proof that she saw early icebergs, but it adds to the body of evidence that it's at least credible.
I know, I love it when different accounts come together like that. You know, when you find evidence that backs up what somebody said, that sort of thing. It's great. That, as a researcher, it's really exciting because so much of the Titanic, you have one person who said something. And that's kind of what people go with. And then, or you get two people and they give you two different versions, or one person who gives you two different versions. But every so often, you know, like with the Nearer My God to Thee, when you get multiple people who say the same thing, it really locks it down.
I can still remember when you and I were at the National Archives in Bayonne, when we were going through those documents and those new Titanic files had just been made public. And I can still remember you saying, aha, he was going to arrive on Tuesday night. We'd obviously seen what's his name's testimony there about, or Mrs. Lyons.
Mrs. Lyons. Well, I remember you and I, when we got back to the hotel that night, because we just, you know, we didn't take the time to read it as we were going through that stuff because we didn't have time. And I remember getting back to the hotel and reading it. We kept laughing because she kept repeating it over and over again. She kept saying, you know, because they'd say, well, what exactly did he say? And she said, we will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday night. And they would say, well, did he say that, you know, we might? And then she would repeat it word for word again. And it got to the point where we were laughing because she just repeated it word for word so many times. She was not going to back down. She wasn't going to deviate, nothing. And I remember we just, you know, we're laughing at how strongly she felt about it, that it certainly did lock it in, you know, that was a great find. There were three things that I think are the holy grail that are out there still, if they exist. But, you know, the depositions that the crewmen all gave, because I know a handful have come to light, but not all of them. They all obviously gave a deposition when they got back to England, and it'd be wonderful if their archives could turn them up somehow. Secondly would be the limitation of liability hearings testimony, if there actually was a court reporter recording those, because all we have are the ones taken remotely. And then there was a third thing that I always felt would be incredible to find, and I can't remember what it is. There were those two things, and it's, you know, Mrs. Douglas's diagram of the restaurant that she said she submitted with her affidavit to the Senate inquiry, but they didn't include it. You know, something like that. But there's like a third thing out there that and those
Gracie's
three
correspondence?
What's that?
I say Gracie's
Oh,
correspondence.
that's probably it. You're right.
Yeah.
It's probably Gracie's. Although I gotta say, most of what's quoted in Gracie's book have we found. You know, like he quotes Mrs. Spedden, and the Spedden family had her things, you know, that sort of thing. And and then he quoted Margaret Brown, and then it turned out he was just quoting her newspaper article from the Newport newspaper. He quoted Elizabeth Schutz, and her account appeared in the Newport newspaper as well. And so a lot, you know, there's a certain amount of letters, but probably half of what Gracie put in his book, we found in other sources. But then maybe it might have been Gracie's papers. Those might have been the third item that I was thinking of. If we could find those, you know, the window of research that those would open up for us, be fantastic.
I will say that in the Titanic Inquiry website, Rob Ottmers has been able to find some of the limitation of liabilities hearings, the depositions, and those have been put in there. There's not.
Well, those are the ones we found those are the ones taken
Okay.
remotely that George and I found in Bayonne.
Okay, I don't remember where Rob said he got them from, but yeah, that's probably it. But there are some of those out there,
Yes,
but not many.
because they went to
Sorry.
Cooperstown and talked to Mrs. Ryerson and Miss Bowen, and then they went to Paris and they talked to Mr. Reams and Mrs. Lyons. And then they went, I think, on board the Olympic and talked to Barrett.
Yeah,
And then they had a separate one from Ismay. But so anything they had taken remotely, but the ones that were actually in the courtroom in New York, we don't have that testimony. And that's what I want. You
Yeah.
know.
yeah. and I'm not saying the Titanic inquiry site, we've put up what we could find. And
Yes,
if, you know, you and
exactly.
George, yeah, but most of it, we've never seen.
If they went to the trouble to take a to transcribe it when it was taken remotely, I would like to think they would have done transcriptions there in the courtroom. There'd be a court reporter doing it. And we got so much information from those that were taken remotely. The people who testified, Mrs. Holverston and Jack Thayer and, Mrs. Renouf and, all these people who actually gave testimony in the courtroom, would love to see it. In fact, there's even testimony that's not passengers, but the people who testified about the lifeboats, the men who went and, did the inventories or whatever. And in one of those testimonies, it even says that a third-class passenger has arrived and they don't get to her that day, but we don't have her testimony. I mean, she left. And so, what happened to her? And so there's all these people who testified at those limitation of liability hearings. And where is that testimony? And a good example is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. They had a lawsuit, over that. And apparently there were 3 volumes of testimony. And just in the last few decades, they found a copy of 2 of the 3 volumes in the New York University, New York University Law School, something like that. They found a couple of them. And they got original testimony after, 80, 90 years, whatever it was. And they only found 2 of the volumes, and they said they had to be so careful because the pages were cracking. They were probably on that old onion skin kind of paper. And I read a book where they were, used a lot of that testimony, and it'd be fantastic since that was a civil case. Why aren't the Titanic ones out there somewhere? And actually a documentary filmmaker one time, even I told them this, and they tracked down a good documentary, but they tracked down somebody who even worked for the law firm, because the law firm is still out there, Hunt, Hill, Betts, and whatever. And they found an old man who'd retired from it, and he had volumes that sort of referenced the case, but he didn't have the testimony. And so the law firm doesn't have them anymore, and I wish they did, but maybe they're in some law school law library somewhere. They may turn up, and that would be fantastic.
That would be, that's a good job for somebody out there.
Yeah.
Here. So people are also watching on a live stream. Nancy asked, Don mentioned Samuel Hemming. Was he married at the time he sailed on Titanic? Why was he chosen to give testimony at the U.S. inquiry?
Oh, Samuel Hemming. Well, if he gave testimony, great. Probably because he had a good story to tell. And I think he did testify at the Senate inquiry. He was, I think, in his 40s. He probably was married. He does have descendants. But I think they just chose people who they felt had something to contribute, and who were maybe more articulate or something like that. And here was somebody, Samuel Hemming swam away from the Titanic to Lifeboat 4. So he had a lot to share because he was on until almost the very end. So I think that might have been one of the reasons they asked him to testify, because, he was there for so long, as a lamp trimmer, whatever.
Isn't Don's memory marvelous?
It is wonderful.
It
I
just
would
astounds
better
me
time.
how he can
Who said
call up this information the way he does. It amazes me.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Joshua Anderson was wondering, does anyone feel Olympic may have gained in passenger numbers in the year after 1912 due to her connections to Titanic? Tourist draw, or did the White Star Line try and tamp that sort of thing down?
That almost sounds like a Mark Turnside question.
Yeah.
My understanding is that there was an initial hit to Olympics passenger lists, but that has been rather overblown. I know Mark has gone back and he's actually, looked at the passenger lists for later 1912, 1913 in the run up to the war. And although Olympics passenger numbers did have that little bit of a dip to begin with, they recovered much more quickly than most books would have those figures recovering. And she was back to her pre-Titanic numbers pretty quickly. Certainly, I think it was within the period after she came back to service after the refit, the 1912 to 13 refit, her numbers were very strong. So I know Walter Lord, speaking of Walter Lord, he always enjoyed traveling on the Olympic. And part of that, he said, was because she was so similar to Titanic. So when he was on Olympic, I remember him saying, I don't know whether it was a documentary or an interview, he said it was very much like being on the Titanic when he was on Olympic.
And he
Yeah,
would,
a lot of passengers, a lot of Titanic survivors did sail on the Olympic. And I knew Harriet Crosby's daughter, and when they sailed on it, she said her mother showed her all around, and this is just like the Titanic. But the White Star Line did try to clamp down on the publicity, because there's that letter that they sent to Francis Brown, Father Brown, asking him to please leave the Titanic out of his presentations because they didn't feel it was benefiting anybody to dredge up what happened. And then Brian Ticehurst, the late Brian Ticehurst of the British Titanic Society, he understood that, as an advertiser in the Southampton newspapers, the White Star Line urged the newspapers not to mention the Titanic. So for years, if a survivor had died, it made no mention that they were a survivor of the Titanic in their obituary, because the newspapers, they were threatened, we'll pull our advertising, which is probably unlikely, but that was his understanding, was that the White Star Line made a real effort with the newspapers where it had pulled to keep the story out of the papers for decades after the Titanic sank.
I know that Walter Lord, when he was on the Olympic, he looked like he was maybe a young teenager. And if he's anything like I was at that age, he would have went on the Olympic and go, I want to see the places that are like Titanic. I want to look at those things. It's like the first time I went on the Queen Mary. First thing I wanted to do was run up to the starboard bridge wing. I was able to cheat and climb out onto the aft stocking bridge. I wanted to see things that relate to what I know about the Titanic. And I mean, like I said, Walter Lord was a teenager at that point in time. I think that's what he would have done. I want to
Probably
see
so.
how it relates.
And how many other young kids did as well, but didn't write books about it?
Good point. And none of us are old enough to have been on the Olympic, because all of us would have done the same thing.
Well, it's funny, just to share the story, but the Harriet Crosby's daughter had her to dinner one time. I think it was for her 90th birthday, roughly. And so I invited some ship nerds over. And they were more interested in the fact that she had sailed on the Olympic than they were in the fact that her mother had sailed on the Titanic. Because that was secondhand, but her sailing on the Olympic was firsthand, and they found that more interesting. So that was kind of fun.
Mike, would you like to show us a couple more artifacts?
Yeah, let's take a little intermission.
All right.
A little artifacts of Mike.
Let's see. We'll do these. It's a set of postcards. There was 11 total of them. I split them with another collector, so I got 6 of them. And they are from Paul Mauger.
Oh.
And he wrote these. It's a series of cards, and he wrote them to, what's her name? Charlotte Anton, who lived in his hometown in France. Orgeval? I can't know the exact pronunciation. Orgeval, France. Anyway, so he wrote these to her and her parents, and it seemed like it maybe was a love interest or something, because he wrote a lot of them. And first 4, I mean, these were during when he was detained, first in the U.S. A lot of them are in New York City. And then the other ones were in London, because he got detained there too when he went back. So the first 4, and it took me a little bit to figure out what was coming, because he's got you can see he's got a P on there, right there. And then these are, let's see, these are May 19th, 1912. May 19th. So these are all May 19th. There's an A, and then there's a U, an L, and a U. So he sent his whole name, one on each card of the letters of Paul. So that was kind of neat. But then the better ones here, he's got one with the Met building, and he writes on the back, and it's in French, of course, but he writes, Paul Mauger, Titanic survivor, happy to be back on firm land and able to write my name. This was June 8th, 1912. And then the second one he writes to Madame. So I think this was to her mother. Where are we at? There we go. And this one he writes, please, Madame Anton, kindly accept the best wishes of a survivor of the Titanic, May 15th, 1912. So those are pretty neat to find. And I guess he never ended up with her because she got married in 1913 to somebody else.
Yeah.
So that was the end of that love story. So those are kind of neat.
It's really neat.
You want to do another one?
Sure.
Yep.
All right. George requested this one, so we'll do this one. Let me take it out of the sheet here. This is a receipt on White Star Line stationery. Let's see if you can. There we go. And you might start recognizing some names on there. So
You
No,
can
you're
tell
gonna have to
all
read it
those-
to us.
all right.
We don't forget our
you
glasses.
can
Anyway,
tell all those
there-
old guys leaning forward and squinting.
Well, I'm just starting using glasses, so I'm not used to it yet. All right, so the date is August 14th, 1911, for the steamer Olympic to sail on August 19th, 1911. And the names are Mrs. Rosa Abbott, Ross Moore, age 16, and Eugene, age 10.
Oh,
Wow.
There we go. So
there,
this would
now,
be,
yeah, now I can see them, yeah.
yeah, this would have been the slip. It's perforated along here, and this is the slip that would have stayed with the ticket agency, and then the other half they would have kept. So this was the voyage. I guess she had gone to Rhode Island, I think.
Yes.
When she got married and had the two boys, and then they had a falling out, and she went back to England on this voyage to live with her mother, with her two sons. And I guess they didn't like it there or whatever reason, and she decided to go back to the States. So she sailed back on the Titanic, and she barely made it. What was collapsible C? She got
A,
on?
collapsible A,
She
yes.
was on A, and unfortunately, the boys, neither one of them made it, so she lost both of them. So yeah, this was a really quite a find at this.
Well, somebody earlier said that when she got off collapsible A, they thought she was going to die. She looked so bad.
That's what Ruth Becker, yeah.
Yeah, and she had been standing up in the lifeboat in the water for a good couple hours. And I'm kind of confused as to how deep the water was in collapsible A. I've seen some references to waist high.
Mhm.
Don might remember better than I do on
I
that.
Yeah,
think that's
that's-
how Williams describes it.
Yeah, they all said waist high, and yet when they found the boat, it didn't look that flooded, but obviously their weight, when they took the people out, it must have risen up a little bit.
Still, waist high sounds a little bit too much.
Yeah,
If it was really waist high, I don't think they would have found anybody alive. But what do I know?
yeah.
Michael, can I ask you, so how do you know that something that you're purchasing is original and not?
Yeah,
something-
it's there's a lot of fakes out there, which is getting to be a real problem. A lot of it's just doing a lot of research. Really, do your homework. I mean, before you start putting money in it, really study, get to know other collectors. I mean, I know like certain collectors that specialize just in like the dinnerware. That's really like silverware is just really getting faked. Anything, one guy in England, anything with a piece of silver he finds at a yard sale, he etches a White Star Line flag and puts it on there on eBay. So it's getting bad. So there's a lot of people specialize in just paper items, and So you really got to do your homework. And
Mike,
It's
earlier
pretty
you mentioned you wanted to buy something that was way outside your price range. Have you ever went together with somebody else to raise extra money to buy something?
other than my wife.
Yeah, other than your wife, yes. Well,
Actually,
reason
yes. I don't know if you're familiar with the Brown Brothers archive that got sold a few years ago, and a lot of negatives have been coming up for them. So a couple of us kind of pulled together and to try to get these. One, so we weren't fighting against each other, and nobody getting them, and two, just because they were not cheap. So that's been one way that I noticed there's some other areas that guys have kind of either pulled together some money and to try to get certain really high end items. Speaking, well, I'll show you this real quick. This is kind of neat. From the Brown Brothers, they were the big picture publisher back then, just like Underwood and Underwood and some of the other ones. So they've been selling. They said it's gonna be like 4 or 5 years it's gonna take them to sell. So you guys might recognize this picture. Pretty famous scene in New York, April 19th. I guess that morning. Anyway, they're inspecting the lifeboats. Well, this is one of those wow items. This is the original, and it's probably gonna be hard to see, but this is the original glass plate negative for that picture.
Wow.
And that came from the Brown Brothers archives. So this one I actually was able to get on my own, but I have a lot of maiden voyage Olympic ones and the 1912 when she was in New York, and a few of us had pulled together to be able to get those, and we got like 15, 16 of them. So
I
that's how
told
we got
Mike
around
that
it.
once he showed that negative, he should drop a glass on the floor.
Every time I hold them, like. So yeah, that was probably that's definitely one of my big wow items to get that.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. I know George has some neat pieces too. George, this question came from this fellow named John Lynch. He wanted to ask you who you think gave the best account of the sinking, in writing or in person.
I have to be honest and say I don't know. My memory is such nowadays that I have a hard time remembering a lot of details. I know where I can find stuff when I need it, but as far as recalling, the details and that's why Don's memory amazes me so much, because he can pull his stuff just out of the air just like that, where I have to go to this book or back to behind me a loose leaf notebook full of microfilm printouts or something. I know where I can find the information I need, but I cannot remember it, on the spur of the moment. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that question, Don. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Don. What were some of the more significant surprises you've encountered in your studies that you can recall, or exciting research that you discovered over the years?
Well, I've got a quick one, I guess, and it's something that I discovered just not too long ago. And I've told Don about it, and some of the other guys might know about it too. But the wireless operator of the Masaba, I ran across a newspaper interview with him, and the Masaba encountered the ice field before the Titanic did and managed to get through it. And as it was starting to steam away from the ice field as evening was falling, this was still daylight, but he observed a mist that was forming around the ice field. And to me, that being a daylight observation, that's tremendously important, because people who dismiss the testimony of some of the crewmen and stuff who say there was a mist that night. I looked back at the iceberg and you couldn't see the bottom of the iceberg because it was enveloped in mist. people have a tendency to just dismiss that as, they were just making excuses or whatever. To me, this Mesaba information is tremendously important because I think there was a mist that night. It didn't extend high. You could look up at the sky and see the stars, unimpeded. It was pure overhead, pure good visibility. I think it lay low over the water, and it was apparently high enough over the water so that people could look underneath it and see the Californian in the distance. But it didn't extend high enough so that it obscured the vision from the bridge while the ship was moving. They still had a clear view of what was ahead, except for what was down below. And I think that may have had a significant effect on the iceberg's visibility. That's just my own opinion, but I think the evidence is fairly persuasive. That's, I guess, my own recent discovery that made a big impression on me.
At one point in time, I remember discussing with George the whole point of the haze and all that. And I took a good look at what Fleet said in the US inquiry, the first inquiry. He doesn't say anything about haze. Then you go over to the British inquiry, and the first one who brings up the haze there is the other lookout, Reginald Lee. And he starts talking about haze. And afterwards, Fleet starts talking about haze. And I was kind of wondering, well, what is Fleet picking up on it and trying to make it look better for himself? And that's kind of what I was thinking. And the other part of it is also Reginald Lee lied at the British inquiry. They asked him, when was the last time you had your eyes checked? And he said, oh, just before this trip. And they kept asking him more and more questions. And eventually he admitted that no, his eyes weren't checked before the trip. So I have a tendency to kind of wonder about Lee with his honesty. But George has come up with a lot more evidence of the haze since I made that statement years ago. So
That's
I've
a
been
good
convinced.
point, though, Bill. It's an excellent point because you can't necessarily take everyone's statements as gospel because there's always questions, always exceptions.
Yep.
So,
Well, that's why I found Ernest Shackleton's testimony so intriguing because he was used to sailing around ice, and he in his opinion, the best view was from where the officers were standing, and he also thought that you should only have one person up in the crow's nest so that you're not distracted and you're just paying attention to your job. I don't know what you guys thought about that.
Certainly, it was well known that if you were down lower to the horizon, you might be able to see something that's above the horizon to you, then if you're up high looking down, it might be concealed behind the edge of the horizon. Very interesting testimony he gave. I know we were going through it when we did On a Sea of Glass. A lot of the statements that he made really like, oh, wow, about whether you could tell if ice was nearby by the temperature of the water and things like that. And he really knew a lot of good detail, and he provided a lot of interesting insight and observations.
Wasn't there also somebody who said he could smell ice? One of
there were
the
several people.
And then there was that whiskers round the light phenomenon that a number of people referred to just before the collision.
I think that was probably connected with the haze. In fact, it may have been, 50% of the haze for that matter.
I think it was George Rowe. George Rowe at the stern, I think, talked about the whiskers around the light that he could see, around the lights, so to speak. So they might have been sailing through the haze.
Yeah.
When light was present, as there was on the ship, it would be sort of, you could see if the air was crystally, crystals floating and stuff. But looking ahead into the darkness from the bridge, there's no light up there, so you're not going to see a haze up ahead. So you can understand where the officers might have thought there was no haze, but I think there's an excellent chance that there was. interestingly, too, half of the people who denied there was haze, were the ship's officers. Whether that's coincidence or not, I don't know.
Sure.
I wrote an article many years ago about how many people how many people at the inquiries actually saw the ship break in half. And quite a bit of people actually said they saw it break in half. The people who said it didn't break in half, 2 of them were officers.
Yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting finds that someone pointed out to me not long ago. Is they claimed they were in the water on boat B. I think it was Victor Sunderland, and he claimed that he overheard Lightoller shout after the ship broke, swim for the stern's going to float. And
Yes.
then later in the inquiry, of course, Lightoller, no, it didn't break, it went down whole.
Exactly. It was Lightoller. I guess it was Lightoller, maybe Pittman, who said it didn't break. Lowe wasn't sure. And there was 1 or 2 passengers who said it didn't break. I think Woolner was maybe one of them. I'm not
Easily.
It's been a long time. But more people said it broke in half. It was like 17 people said it did not, or it broke in half. 4 people said it broke or did not break. And a bunch of people didn't say. And there was quite a lot of stuff, especially at the British Inquiry, where the assessors would say, did you see the ship sink? Yes. Let's change the subject. They would, the next obvious question is, what did you see? And they were specifically not asking that. They changed the subject to something else.
I remember when we were doing the breakup appendix for On a Sea of Glass, we were trying to tally, like what you're talking about, Bill, how many people said one thing as opposed to another. And I know Mike Poirier has been continuing to try to piece together, a tally of how many people said the ship broke. And there was a couple of interesting accounts that he found from people who testified at the inquiry, who at the inquiry said they either didn't see it or that it had gone down intact. But then reliable accounts that he found afterwards from the same people seemed to indicate that maybe they did see the ship break, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I just pulled up my article to refresh my memory. The 4 people who said the ship sank intact were Lightoller, Pittman, Hugh Woolner, and Thomas Dillon. And Thomas Dillon claimed that he was on the stern of the ship when it went under. And he said it sank intact. But I guess there were 14 people who said the ship broke apart. Remember, these are just inquiry testimonies I'm talking about. And there's 74 people who did not state or know whether the ship broke apart. And like I said, at the British Inquiry, quite a number of them were asked, did you see the ship sink? And they said yes. And then the assessors changed the subject. They weren't pressed on it.
Wow.
Another interesting topic connected with the reliability of the officer testimony in that was Lightoller's statement at the inquiries that Murdoch was swept into the sea and that he didn't shoot himself. Years ago, I was discussing with Suzanne Stormer, Murdoch's biographer, these things. And she said that she talked with a friend of Lightoller's who said that Lightoller told him that he knew someone on the Titanic who took his own life that night. Now, why would Lightoller say something like that? Why make up something that wasn't true when you're talking with a personal friend? That made a big impression on me. I mean, we'll never know for certain, but you run into people, I call them basically Murdoch groupies, who they think Murdoch could do no wrong. He wasn't the type of man to take his own life. Not true. My next door neighbor in Mount Clemens took her own life. She wasn't the type of person to take her own life either, but she did. So under the right circumstances, anyone can do it. So for what it's worth.
And Lightoller, I think it was Lightoller himself who said years later that the British Inquiry was just a whitewash. He knew that what came out wasn't quite the truth.
Yeah. And I also, of course, I went back with Lightoller where, Colonel Gracie testified that Lightoller told him he had to use his gun. And then Lightoller then testified, I could be a little bit off, but then when Lightoller testified himself, he said he didn't even have a gun or something like that. But then in his memoirs, he said, well, I was carrying a gun, but it wasn't loaded. And, you just couldn't trust the guy. You really couldn't. And I think he had an agenda, very much so. Like, and one of the things that's come up several times is like the fact that the rockets, when they went up white, then they burst into a different color each time. And Lightoller, again, was one of the ones who said it didn't, and that they were always white. And yet when you look at the other people who described the rockets, the American Inquiry, most of them said, I think, one person backpedaled a little bit, but they had pretty much said different colors each time. And so you couldn't trust him no matter what. And so for him to say the British Inquiry was a whitewash, he had a hand in it. He did. You just can't trust him.
Yeah, that was my point. But then, in his what was his book, 1934?
About then, 35, yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
He said things in that book that disagree with what he said in the inquiries.
Right.
If I'm recalling correctly, in the inquiries, he said the engineers never came up. But then in his 1930s book, he said he saw some of them at the end. Which is it? This gets into what I've heard from both Don and George, that we prefer earlier accounts than later accounts. Later accounts, people's, they're trying to fit pieces together and they just have to make up things to say.
Well, or in this case, in his later account, he was more relaxed about the facts. Then see, Lightoller's one where I would almost take his later account over his earlier one. Like again, like with the gun, his later account, he admitted he had a gun. The inquiry, he denied he had it, yet he told Colonel Gracie he had to use his gun. And so, I think Lightoller's the exception. He's the one where I would probably trust his memoirs more than I would trust his 1912 testimony. But everybody else, I would trust the 1912 accounts more.
I know that was an interesting point with Boxall that we found not too long ago. We were doing some research for boat number 2, and he mentioned in 1912 that he'd been sent around to the starboard side to try to find an open gangway door. And that was as far as he, went in the 1912 testimony. But later in his 52, 52, it was his later interview for the BBC.
Yeah, you got it right, Kent.
62.
That's what I'm remembering too.
Yeah, he remembered having seen that gangway door open. And he was afraid of getting too close to it because there was a crowd of people there, and he was afraid of being swamped. So they, that's another interesting, which one do you buy? Do you buy the 1912 version, or do you buy the later version where maybe he's a little more relaxed and, a little detail pops out that maybe he didn't want to come out in 1912? Just interesting possibilities.
Yeah. Wasn't it Harold Cottam from the Carpathia who said in his old age that the true story of the whole wireless thing would never really be known? And boy, I wonder, I'd love to know what he was talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I think if I remember correctly, it almost sounded like Bride was more at the wireless on the Carpathia than Cottam was.
It may have been, but I think between the two of them, yeah. But I think as far as what was going on, transpiring amongst people that night or something, and maybe he was referring to the fact that, they didn't want to deal with the German liners or something, it's just no telling. It's hard to say. And even Cottam, he gave 2 different versions of hearing the SOS, one of which was he just put on the headphones while he was reaching down to take off his shoes. And then the other version was, and I think these are both 1912 versions, was that he actually radioed the Titanic and said, hey, do you know you have wireless messages waiting for you from Cape Race? And, he gave, or Cape Cod, maybe, I can't remember which, but anyway, it was funny because he gave 2 different accounts. And so again, like with Bride, where it was all over the map a little bit, Cottam even gave it a little bit all over the map. And so I think, there's things that, and sometimes people forget years later that they were supposed to keep their mouth shut. And boy, like if you watch forensic files, one of the things you learn is that they can solve a crime by waiting long enough for DNA evidence to be developed, or you just wait long enough to where people think they can admit that they did it because it's been 20 years and they don't think there are any ramifications. And it's funny how on those shows, they get criminals to actually, they'll wire somebody up with a mic as some brother-in-law and say, you really did kill her, didn't you? And they'll say, yeah, I did, because after 20 years, they think it's okay, and that's kind of what happened with the Titanic. You let enough time pass, and I think, Boxhall and Lightoller and a few others, they could finally admit certain things that they weren't willing to admit in 1912 because they thought enough time had passed, it wouldn't matter.
Sometimes it's just the way memory works.
Mhm.
When my sister and I were little, my dad worked at the Coast Guard training station in Groton, Connecticut. Kathy and I talk about what we remember of the training station. Her memories do not match mine.
Yeah.
We have no agenda, but they're not the same.
Mhm.
It's just, it's just your mind, your memory just kind of changes over time.
They do. And sometimes, you write things down and you go back and read it 10 years later, and it's like, wow, I wrote it at the time, but that's not how I remember it. And,
Exactly.
that's exactly how it is. Well, and I've talked about that. I mentioned that, I think, in that article I wrote about Edwina Trout for the Commutator and about what boat she wasn't in. And my memory of things that she told me was different, which fortunately I'd written them down at the time, because when I went back to my notes, it's like, oh, that's not what I remember her saying at all. But I have to go with what I wrote down at the time because it was fresh in my mind. And, like you said, sometimes, memories come back to you or whatever, and where she suddenly remembered at the age of 100 that they pulled a man into her boat. And I'd never heard her say that before. And she said, sometimes these things just come back to me.
Hmm.
And whereas my memory was that she said it bothered her, so she never talked about it, but I was completely wrong on that one. So it's just, things, memories change, whatever. But I do think, the 1912, especially like letters, which is why George's book is so fantastic, the collection of letters and things, because if they wrote it themselves, chances are it's a little more realistic than something they verbally said to a reporter who then passed it through his editor before it made it into the papers.
That's why it's so important you can't just take the inquiry testimony. You have to look at the larger body, and where there's multiple accounts from one survivor, you can compare those accounts. You can literally put them right up next to each other, with modern technology and a computer, and you can kind of draw lines. Okay, there's this, and then there's this, and then, oh, you must have remembered this detail here. But if you're just looking at one source, and sometimes at the inquiries, I think there was a kind of an attempt maybe to, I don't want to catch any blame for what happened, so maybe I'll just kind of steer clear of this detail or that one a little bit in my recollection. But like you say, in a private letter, or sometimes what I really think are good too, or some of the original newspaper accounts are actually transcribed letters that had that showed up from family members.
Yeah, some are, yes.
Yeah, and you look at those and it's like, okay, that makes sense. It has that ring of truth to it. You can compare it with other evidence and see where it all fits together.
I remember when I was transcribing George Rowe's accounts at the British Inquiry, looking at it and going, boy, there's a lot of stuff he was not asked about that would have been great to know. He claims that he didn't know anything was wrong until like 12:25. But there had to be people running around up on the boat deck. He says nothing about that. He claims that he didn't know anything was funny until he saw a lifeboat in the water. He had to have seen stuff, but I don't know.
Steam blowing off and all sorts of stuff.
Well, and he also talked about how he was all alone back there and that no one came to relieve him. And yet his relief, I want to say it was Quartermaster Bright, testified that he did show up and the two of them stood there together.
And talked.
Yeah,
And I think Bright may have shown up a little bit late, but still he was back there. And Rowe doesn't say a word about Bright.
no, not at all.
He talks about his relief showed up late, but that's it.
Yeah,
But he doesn't say anything about what he and Bright collectively did after that.
Mhm.
yeah.
I mean, we could answer, if we were questioning George Rowe, there's all kinds of great questions we could ask him and find out about. But we weren't there in 1912.
Yeah, and sometimes, of course, we recognize today some people have PTSD, immediately after an event, and sometimes it kicks in later, kind of thing. And so, we're not really, we don't know for sure who was really in their best mind. I guess you could say some people, I think, were still pretty traumatized, and then some people, some people can't tell the same story twice. And then for all we know, some of these people, and maybe they didn't choose the really stupid ones to give evidence, but, that like in a lot of these cases, some of these firemen, they'd never been to school, they'd never learned to write, and they might have been intelligent people, but they weren't well educated. And plus they were so intimidated by, these lords, who were interrogating them. And there's all sorts of factors like that that doesn't come across on the testimony because it's not there in black and white.
I think it was Steward Samuel Rule who said in the inquiry that my memory's been a little messed up since the accident. And when you actually look at what Rule says, he says the lifeboats on the starboard forward section left 1, 3, 5, and 7. But you look at everybody else and they say exactly the opposite. 7, 5, 3, 1. Rule is the outlier. He's the one that doesn't agree with anybody else. But he said his memory's been kind of not too good since the accident. So like Kent was implying, we have to go with a bullseye.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out to the audience that Mike Beatty had to leave. He's got to be up awake early tomorrow to go to work, so he had to leave kind of abruptly. But we're very, very grateful that he came and showed his artifacts to us and contributed what he did. It was a big help. So thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. You have some neat things. How's
I
everybody?
remember the question list, we're not even halfway done with it.
feeling?
That's
Have to do it again next week.
I know, we'll have to meet again. Someone did ask, Lauren asked about referencing and copyright rules when writing a book, especially the people who sailed on Titanic. What are the do's or don'ts if you want to publish something? Maybe that'll be our last question.
Well,
Kent, you might know that.
Go
Kent,
ahead, Bill.
I'm thinking Kent might know something about that.
Some, I do like to get input from others who've been in the field. There are certain archives over in the UK that they're crown copyright still. They don't prefer that you write verbatim, lengthy quotes, passages, reproduce certain things. I know that there's also UK copyright law that talks about anything before 1947 is open copyright. There's some question on that. It's a little bit more complicated with US law. Most of the original, 1912 newspapers, a lot of those newspapers don't even exist anymore. They're held in libraries and, so I think in those circumstances, there's no question, that it's not a problem to quote certain things. And there's also, if you have a piece of information that you suspect could be under copyright, if you quote it verbatim, you can also paraphrase it and contain the gist of the information and then reference it back to the original so that someone could go into that archive and actually read it. So there are ways that if you're concerned about it, you can play it safe while still getting the information into the hands of readers.
Yeah, I was surprised one time. I talked to the Copyright Office in Washington, D.C. about letters. And if you buy a letter written by someone on the Titanic, you only own the piece of paper. You don't own what's written on it. And so I don't remember who does. I mean, if the original letter writer is still living, they do, obviously. But I can't remember. It's very complicated. It really is. It's a very, slippery slope. And I think the average person doesn't know that. And so you kind of have a lot of freedom to quote letters if the owner of the letter, provides it to you. But, it is a little iffy sometimes. And the same thing with photographs. You get a print or something, but the actual person with the negative very often is the person who has the rights to the photo, or the original photographer, versus even the holder of the negative. There's all these different, as with all laws, there's gray areas all over the place. That's probably not being very helpful. I'm just saying that.
Hey, Ken, when we did Recreating Titanic, did our artists have the copyright on their pictures? Is that how we did it?
Yeah, they own the pictures and they're free to do anything that they want with them moving forward. But they agreed to allow us to use their work to help illustrate our book. And we wanted to introduce their work to the maritime community. So that was one of the things that, we told them, if you allow us to use some of your imagery, we'll make sure to credit you and all of that. And they were so generous with their materials. It was awesome.
Yeah. And they were able to illustrate various places on the Titanic that I'd never imagined what it would look like. I remember there was somebody did the top of the second class elevator up on the boat deck inside the room. And I never had really thought about what that looked like, but that particular artist had. And is it 100% historically accurate? Probably not. But still, it's interesting to see how they imagined that looked like.
I think that was Chris Walker. There were a couple of the artists who were so passionate about their work that I remember one of them wanted to change the linoleum floor color in the third class entrance. I think that was Chris that wanted to do that because he'd run across some imagery of the wreck and realized it was a different color from Olympics. And so he was able to switch that out in time. I remember another one, he had a bench in the wrong spot. And he had learned since he did the original artwork that the bench didn't belong there in that particular view. And I remember we asked him, this is a really cool view. Can we, and he said, I'd prefer not to use that one because that bench wasn't there. And I'm like, that's dedication right there to getting it right.
Getting back to the original question about copyrights, one thing about newspapers in the United States is that, or books for that matter, anything published before 1923 is copyright free. It's out of copyright and can be used. I should stress that means something that's been published. As Don mentioned, letters and unpublished documents and stuff, I'm not certain about. It's a gray area, and there's likely to be all sorts of complications. But at least if you have a published source that appeared before 1923 in the United States, you can feel free to use that verbatim in your book or article or whatever if you wish, because it's perfectly free to use.
I know that some of the copyright issues here in the United States gets kind of weird. George and I both mentioned we're into Edgar Rice Burroughs. If I wanted to publish an edition of Tarzan and the Apes, which originally came out in 1912, I can do it. However, the copyright on the name Tarzan is owned by Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated. A lot of Burroughs materials has fallen out of copyright just because it was written 100 and more years ago. But there's certain things that the Burroughs Incorporated still owns. I can't write a novel about Tarzan and call him Tarzan. I can change the name to somebody else and do it, but I can't write a book about Tarzan without negotiating with Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated and them saying, okay, Bill, you can do it. I don't understand all the ins and outs.
I think the name Herald of the Apes kind of grips you too, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, Bundolo, George.
Yeah.
Well, George of the Jungle is taken.
Yeah, there you go.
George,
Curious
George
George.
of the jungle, friend to you and me. Oh, yeah, before the tree.
You're dating yourself.
Yeah.
We all are.
Well, I made the crack earlier today about there's going to be quite a number of white hairs on this video tonight.
Some have more white hairs than others,
Yeah.
because I got a bald patch.
My wife has told me when we started dating, she was looking for somebody with hair because her ex-husband was bald. So I know that if I lose my hair, she's gonna dump me
You're
like
out,
a
yeah.
hot potato.
Yeah. She walks.
Do you guys have any questions for each other?
No, we covered it before we started.
Yeah, pretty much.
That was fun. So has everyone here met George in person?
Yes.
I haven't met Kent, but I've met everyone else. I haven't met
Oh.
Mike either. But Don
I
and
met
Bill
Mike
have.
either.
I hope I'll be able to remedy the situation and meet Kent and Mike in person someday in the future too.
Yeah, that would be
That'd be
wonderful.
awesome.
Well, I was waiting for a THS convention this year, but doesn't look like that's happening.
I was
Me
afraid that would come
too.
up.
We talked about that in our last meeting with Don.
Yeah,
Anything?
because the THS wanted to have a 60th, but I'm kind of thinking that it might be early next year if we actually do something, because I would like to see something happen. I would like to see a convention. And so, but at this point, because we're already well into 2023, maybe it would be an April thing next year. We'll have to see. Someone's got to, organize the whole thing. And as I get older, I don't know how I used to do it back in the day, because, we talked about that before, but, the first one I ever organized, and obviously I didn't do these things alone. I had a lot of help, but the one I was in charge of was 1987, and we had over 1,000 people. And it's like, oh,
Wow.
I couldn't do that today. And so, but obviously we're not going to get those kinds of numbers, but, maybe we could do something early next year, for the anniversary.
If it's on the East Coast, I'm coming.
Yeah, we try to keep it simple.
New York, New York.
I remember, Don, you were on the go from start to finish at that convention. You didn't have any rest at all.
Oh, no. And there was one, I think it was one of the Boston ones, I think 1992, that was so on the go and so without sleep. And I got really sick afterwards. I came down with the flu or something, and I was just miserable because I'd just been, pushed to the limit. So yeah, it was just hard. I didn't get to enjoy them back then because I was too busy the whole time.
Yeah, if you're the promoter, you don't enjoy the show. You're too
No,
busy.
you really don't.
I did comic book conventions for 13 years, and I missed out on most of the fun.
Yeah,
That's also why I like going to the THS conventions, because I can just hang loose and talk to George and talk to Don and talk to other people and just enjoy myself.
Yeah, the best times of the conventions for me was when we'd have a bus tour and half the people would be out of the hotel and I could just sit back and relax a little bit. But like even with the survivors, we had to arrange things for them to do and keep an eye on them and stuff like that, and have multiple different activities so that people would always have something to do. And it just, those things, obviously, like I said, they're smaller now. We wouldn't do all that. But boy, back then it was such a chore. But anyway, I was glad I did it. I don't regret doing them, obviously. And I'm flattered, like even today, Mike Beatty, mentioning that he was at the 87 convention, because it seems like everybody was. But, it's people look back fondly on those early conventions, and I'm glad that they do. So, but yeah, we'll maybe push for something in the early next year.
We gotta find some young people to help you with that. Young, energetic people.
We used to try to find somebody. I'm sorry, I'm taking this well over, time. but we try to find someone like local who'd step up to help. But I found that very often people would contact you, and when you first say we're going to do a convention in your city, and you get this, we'd love to help. And then you'd never hear from them again after you reach out to them and say, hey, can you do this or this? And no response. And then, or, one convention we had somebody and they thought they were in charge and they were like spending money, and it's like, no, you don't get to do things like that. It's like, no, we just wanted somebody who could be a point of contact with, this kind of stuff. So, it's hard to get help. It really is. It's hard to get good help, especially for something temporary. And if it's in a town where you don't know anybody and you're just kind of like relying on your good faith, doesn't always work. But anyway.
You did a
Yes,
great
it would be
job
nice to get young
indicating-
people take over. Yes. Go. I'm sorry, George.
I just said you did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well,
Well, I've
you were
got some
the helpers.
Yeah.
I've
We've
been to
got some-
about 4 THS conventions, or 4 or 5, and I've enjoyed all of them.
Oh, good.
But then I'm not working now.
I know.
The first convention I went to was on the Queen Mary. Milvina Dean was there. She's the only survivor I've ever met. And I remember being there, and we were in one room at one point. I'm looking around and I recognize you, Don. I saw George over on the other side of the room, but I'd never talked to him, so I'm not going to do that. Like I mentioned earlier, I snuck out on the aft docking bridge, even though I wasn't supposed to. I met a few people while I was there, and I think that was the convention where I found a flyer toward the end and says, do you want to talk to Titanic people online? And I took it up and I joined John Davis's mailing list.
Oh,
And that was, what was that, 95? 97? One of the two. The one that Melvina was at.
she was at several there. Might have been the 97 one. I think it was 97 because she was there. And is that the one where we kind of talked about the movie, which it wasn't yet out?
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah,
think so.
okay, yeah.
And you and Ken were there, and I got Melvina and you and Ken to sign my illustrated history. I remember that.
Oh,
But anyway, I saw this flyer and it got me online, and not long after that, I met George.
hmm.
And we started
Wow.
chatting, and then we started talking about lifeboats.
Yeah,
Went
life is
downhill.
good.
So you
You know-
say, I always thought it was Milvina. It's pronounced
No,
Milvina.
it is Milvina, yes.
They know, he knows better than I do. It's just because I read so much and I'm kind of phonetic.
Yeah,
I have a tendency to look at the words in a certain way. And I was at a convention a year or two ago, and Shelley Binder, which is Leah Ack's great granddaughter, was there. And I was talking about that. I said, well, she went to Norfolk. And Shelley starts laughing. She said, Bill, it's not Norfolk. I said, well, that's the way the letters spell. And she says, it's Norfolk.
that sounds awful.
Yeah,
No, it's Shelley. What do you want? No, but the point was, is I nobody had ever said the word to me before. So I just pronounced it the same way the letters were.
Well, Edwina Trout was from Bath, England, and people from England always say it's Bath. And what I discovered was people who aren't from Bath call it Bath. But if you're from there, I think you call it Bath. Because Winnie always called it Bath. And so I think that's like a regional, but like, Jill, I mean, you couldn't pronounce where I came from the other day. So.
Walla
I
Walla?
did. I messed it up totally.
Was that Walla Walla?
Oh, that's easy. That's when they liked it so much, they named it twice. No, I don't even know if I've ever even been to Walla Walla.
Oh,
No, I'm
okay.
from-
Somewhere
I'm from-
remembering Walla
I'm from,
Walla.
well, I was born in Coeur d'Alene and I grew up mostly in Spokane. And Jill couldn't get either one of them.
I
think
ran
said
across somebody who
Spokane.
called it. I ran across somebody who called it Spokane.
There you
Yeah,
go.
I think that's what I said.
Well, I gotta
That's the
tell you,
way
just for
pronounced.
background, they only added the E so it would look better. It's named after the local Indian tribe, and originally it was called Spokane Falls, but there was no E on it. And then they dropped the word falls and they added an E so that it actually looked like a better word.
Yeah, it looks like
That's the story
Spokane.
I was told, but who knows?
You know, Don, as much as I enjoy going to the conventions and listening to the Titanic lectures and that, to me, the most important part is being able to bum around with my friends and
Yeah.
catch up and just enjoy each other's company and stuff. If we held a convention and the word Titanic never came up, I would still go because
Yeah.
that's how much I enjoy getting together with my friends.
Yeah, oh, I agree totally. It's been the best. And then back in the day, that was the only way we were in touch before the internet, and just, letters and going to conventions. Yeah.
No, so maybe it doesn't have to be a big THS gathering. Maybe someone could organize something.
One
smaller.
time we just did a dinner once, I think on the Queen Mary, and I think there was one time where we just did a dinner in Springfield and we really didn't have a big event and we still had a decent turnout. And we could do something like that again.
Yeah, the Queen Mary's open again.
Yeah,
No, it's not East Coast like Bill asked for.
yeah. I like doing it at the Hilton in Boston. I like the fact that we could fly there and you didn't have to rent a car or even leave the airport in order to get to the hotel. That was a great location.
I vote for that next year. Though I
Okay,
would end up driving from South Carolina anyway, but
yeah, but once you park there, you're good. No, I liked it
Right,
because they had the
that's true.
shuttle into town. I'm sorry, Jill?
Yeah, you got our votes. Yeah,
Okay,
you
all
wouldn't
right,
have
good
to
to
rent a
know.
car.
Great, cool.
But one of the conventions at one of the museums, it was a really big to do for me. Getting from the airport to the museum.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, well, you got our votes.
Okay, good to know.
Maybe we get Kent to come in.
Yeah.
I've been trying to talk Kent to go come into some get together of some kind. I've never met Kent face to face and we've written 2 or 3 books together.
Wow, I want to be there when you meet. That'll be fun.
We were trying to organize something at Pigeon Forge to see if we could do a book signing or an event down there, but it's very difficult to actually get the 3 of us with dates that work and would also work for the museum. It would be really cool to meet up down there and to do an event. It would be awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to go. I've only been to Branson, not Pigeon Forge.
I went to Pigeon Forge last summer. Took my wife there. Was very impressed with their presentation. Really, really enjoyed it a lot. I loved, of course, Bill would have loved it. They have the right numbers on the.
Because they work with Phil Gowan and Gowan had the numbers.
Yep.
Yeah.
So very impressed.
Yeah. I heard it's a little bigger too than Branson, maybe.
I'm not
I've only been to
sure.
Pigeon Forge.
Which one is bigger, Don?
Oh, I said I've only been to Pigeon Forge. I don't know if the other one's bigger or not.
I've heard one of them is bigger, and I've been to both, but I couldn't tell you which one it is.
Yeah, that would be a nice location. So
One of
we
these
have a
things
book
we'll have to
club
work out.
gathering. We could create a little book club gathering, and then you could put it on the book club members instead of having to deal with it yourself, Don.
Yeah.
I'll
Have any
jot that
questions,
down.
Jill?
We do, but I don't know if we should have another event. We have a lot of questions left here, and I'm having trouble trying to discern.
If we keep going on the questions, we'll be here till midnight.
I know,
Probably.
that's what I was thinking. I didn't know if we wanted to try to do this again or
That may be the best bet.
yeah. We know it's later for you guys. It's only 6:20 for me, but the East Coast people, it's 8:20.
Maybe
Well,
Tad will be.
I will admit, my wife is waiting for me for dinner.
Oh yeah, you gotta eat
Same here.
dinner. That's important. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's wind it up. And thank you so much for joining and celebrating George's new book. And has anyone picked it up yet? I'm still waiting for mine.
I haven't gotten it yet.
Oh,
I
yeah,
ordered
Bill.
it. I ordered it, I think almost immediately when George announced it at Amazon UK. And I think I got it within 2 weeks, even
Wow.
coming across the ocean.
Nice.
We
And
look
it's a
forward
good
to
book. I've read it. Good stuff.
Congratulations, George.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you, guys. I'm very
Yeah.
grateful that you guys showed up tonight and participated. I was really looking forward to it, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It really
Thank you
meant
for inviting us.
been fun.
it's really fun. Thank you
We should
so
have
much.
talked about the gamblers more, but no, it's all
Eh,
Next time.
right.
Well,
Yeah.
I wanted to share screen before we go. Someone on Goodreads had I thought it was a great little review from somebody that wasn't in our book club, just somebody on Goodreads. And she said, when the ship struck the iceberg, there was only the very slight impact. We joked at the thought of the Titanic going down after a second resumed our poker game. So this is different of all the other Titanic books I've read before. It focuses on 3 passengers who boarded the Titanic and were also gamblers. The gambling side of things didn't interest me, but when it comes to cards, I know snap, and that's about it. But the rest of the book I enjoyed. Some of the final moments of Titanic mentioned in this book were very moving. I'm amazed I've never come across these men before, especially with all the hate that J. Bruce Ismay received. He's a saint compared to these guys. They were used to taking a gambler's chance of being caught while fleecing a lamb, but the stakes had suddenly been raised. Now they were playing in earnest, and their lives would be forfeit if they lost. I thought it was kind of neat to just see a random review from somebody who doesn't study Titanic like we
that might be the
do.
only review that ever happens.
No, you'll get some. We look forward to Bill's. Bill's gonna write the first review. Hopefully. Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for watching, and we look forward to getting people together in the future, and thanks for supporting the book club. We're really trying to focus on you know, historical facts and try to clear up some of the misconceptions or facts that people have been carrying on, like you said, from some of the old literature. So we appreciate the new research that keeps coming out, and for you guys all getting together.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Thanks for inviting
Thank
us.
you.
Thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you all again.
Yeah,
It was really
likewise.
fun. Sure, it was really fun for the members too.
Yeah.
All right, enjoy your evening. Enjoy your
Okay.
dinner.
Have a good night.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.